Alors, bonjour tout le monde.
Good afternoon. This is the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Aid and International Development. This is February the 14th, St. Valentine's Day.
So don't do anything you wouldn't want your mother to see. And pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2, we are continuing our study into the human rights situation in Eritrea, a study which has revealed some fascinating testimony so far. Felix Horn, who is a researcher on the Horn of Africa for Human Rights Watch, is our witness today, and this promises to be a very interesting meeting indeed. Mr. Horn, please feel free to begin. As you know, we'd like you to keep your testimony around 10 minutes. It's not a firm deadline, but that allows us to allow maximum time for interaction with the members of the committee, given the constraints that we face on our time. So please feel free to begin.
Thank you. As this committee is aware, Eritrea is one of the world's most repressive countries. Its government has pursued a path of crushing political repression at home and a belligerent foreign policy. There's no civil society, there's no independent media, no elections have been held since independence in 1993, and torture is widespread. Eritrea's impoverished economy has also suffered greatly because of the government's political and diplomatic isolation. But in recent years, the government has actively courted international investors attracted by the country's large and untapped mineral resources. The Bisha project, which is majority owned and operated by Canadian firm Nevsun Resources, is Eritrea's first and so far only operational mine. It began gold production in 2011 and produced some $614 million worth of ore. And just to kind of put that in perspective, the entire GDP of Eritrea is $2.6 billion. So it's a significant amount, significant input into the Eritrean economy. Other companies from Australia, China, and Canada are poised to develop further mines. Now, Eritrea is also well known for its national service program, which uses forced labor indefinitely. Through this program, the Eritrean government keeps an enormous number of Eritreans under perpetual government control as conscripts. Originally conceived as an 18-month program, the national service scheme now requires all able-bodied men and most women to serve indefinitely, often for years, with no end in sight, under harsh and abusive conditions. Those who try to flee risk imprisonment, torture, and even reprisals directed against their families. Eritrea's national service program is not a secret. There is a lot of documentation about the type of violations and type of abuses that take place under that program. In 2009, Human Rights Watch produced Service for Life, which outlined some of those violations, including the use of forced labor. Now, some national service conscripts are assigned to state-owned construction companies who exercise a complete monopoly in the field. International mining firms operating in Eritrea face intense government pressure to engage these contractors to develop some of their project infrastructure. Now, if they do so, they run a pronounced risk of, in the least, indirect involvement in the use and harsh mistreatment of forced laborers. This means that international mining companies, including Nevsun Resources, could see their projects developed on the backs of forced labor. Now, when Nevsun Resources began building its Bisha mine in 2008, it failed to conduct human rights due diligence activity, and it did not have adequate procedures in place to ensure that forced labor was not being used to develop the project. At the government's insistence, the Bisha project engaged Sagan Construction Company, which is a state-run PFDJ contractor. And there's evidence that Sagan regularly exploits national service conscripts in its activities. Now, Human Rights Watch interviewed some Eritreans who worked at Nevsun's Bisha mine project in various capacities, including two who said they were conscripts forced by Sagan to carry out construction work at the mine site during its initial development. There was also clear evidence that many of Sagan's workers at Bisha during that period faced terrible conditions, from inadequate food supplies to unsafe housing. The workers we interviewed said that national service conscripts lived in fear and had been ordered not to complain about their situation. One former conscript told Human Rights Watch that he was captured and imprisoned after leaving the mine site without permission in order to attend a friend's funeral. And since the publication of the report, numerous other individuals have come forward, and their testimonies and stories are very consistent with the type of allegations that we outlined in the report. Now, Human Rights Watch engaged in an extensive dialogue with Nevsun about these allegations to try to understand what steps the company has taken to address them. Since our engagement with Nevsun, to their credit, they have tightened their policies, largely through an improved screening procedure that is meant to vet all workers at the mine to ensure that they're there voluntarily. Nevsun, as you know, says that these policies are now adequate to the task of keeping their project free of forced labor. But, and this is critical, the company does not know for certain whether conscript laborers are being used at Bisha or not. When Nevsun sought to interview Sagan workers in an effort to assure the company was not complicit in the abuses, they were refused by Sagan. When they sought to visit the camps to investigate the living conditions of Sagan workers, again, they were refused. So its efforts to investigate these allegations have been obstructed by Sagan itself. And Nevsun appears to feel that it has no power to confront its own state-run contractor about these allegations of abuse. Instead, its response to Sagan's stonewalling has been one of quiet acceptance. But Nevsun cannot simply pass on the responsibility for human rights problems at its mine site to the contractor it is paying to work there. Any human rights abuses by Sagan would implicate Nevsun, and Nevsun has a responsibility to investigate them and to ensure that they stop. So for us, the lessons here are clear. Mining firms must either find ways to ensure that their Eritrea operations do not involve them in the use and maltreatment of forced labor, or they should not invest there at all. They cannot afford to develop human rights safeguards on the fly when project development is already underway. They must develop them before they begin mine development. And if their projects in Eritrea do become complicit in the use of forced labor, they should be held accountable by their own governments and by their shareholders. So we believe that Nevsun should immediately work to address the shortcomings of its engagement in Eritrea and refuse to continue operating under the status quo. The company should insist on full cooperation from its partners in investigating the allegations of human rights abuses connected to the mining project. Nevsun's experience should serve as a clear reminder to other mining and exploration firms, including the other Canadian firm, that they are now on notice and that they face the risk of being complicit in human rights abuses should they choose to invest in Eritrea's mining sector. Unfortunately, there is no indication that other mining firms developing projects in Eritrea are taking these risks seriously enough. 3 firms, including Canada's Sunridge Gold, are actively moving ahead with plans to develop new mines in Eritrea, while other firms are exploring numerous other potential projects. Canadian firm Sunridge failed to reply to repeated efforts to contact them by phone and by writing. In conclusion, our report serves as a strong example of why governments like those of Canada need to develop mechanisms that pay close attention to the human rights records of their companies when they operate abroad. We call on the Government of Canada to do 3 things. Firstly, to implement legal frameworks that allow government institutions to monitor the human rights performance of Canadian companies when they operate abroad in areas that carry serious human rights risks, such as Eritrea. Secondly, to take steps to regulate the human rights conduct of domestic companies operating abroad in these complex environments, such as requiring companies to carry out some form of human rights due diligence. And thirdly, we hope that Canada would communicate an expectation to the government of Eritrea that companies investing in their mining sector should not be using forced labor or be involved in any other human rights abuses. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Horn, before we go to our questioners, I just wanted to ask you, you gave some numbers and I just missed it on the beginning. The total GDP of Eritrea, you said, was $2.6 billion. What did you say the Bisha mines revenues were?
In 2011, $614 million worth of ore.
So more or less a quarter of the total GDP of the entire country.
Correct.
Right.
Significant amount.
And that would be a fairly accurate number, I assume, because Nevsun has to report back to its shareholders and therefore has a responsibility at this end, if not in Eritrea, to be precise about its numbers.
My understanding is that that number is based on Nevsun's communications.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. So it is 20 past, according to my watch. We've lost our inaccurate clock over there, you may notice. This should give us time to have a 6-minute question and answers per questioner. But if you ask a long question, I may have to interrupt our witness in order to allow others to also pose questions. So please be concise. That's a message not for our witness, but to our MPs. We begin with Mr. Sweet.
Thank you for that message, Mr. Chair, and I'll be as concise as I possibly can. Thank you very much for your presence here, Mr. Horn. Mr. Horn, I wanted to ask you for your comment on a statement that was made by Mr. Davis, who is here before us, President and Chief Executive Officer of Nevsun Resources. He said Nevsun has only limited ability to influence and control events in Eritrea, but neither are we without influence so long as we exercise it judiciously. We're practicing the tried and true Canadian approach of quiet diplomacy. You had mentioned that you wanted to give Nevsun some credit in that regard. Do you feel that they're doing a good job in this regard, as he stated?
I mean, it's difficult. The Nevsun should have employed these sorts of procedures and had these sorts of discussions before they began operations. Once the mine is operational, it's very, very difficult to put these sorts of procedures in place. Given that they didn't do that, they have taken steps in the right direction in terms of putting in some processes. But the fact that they're not allowed to visit the Sagan camp and interview Sagan workers, the subcontractor that they are paying themselves, is a huge problem. They still cannot determine whether or not they are using forced labor.
Well, Mr. Davis said on a question that I asked him regarding that very thing of regarding some things that were on the internet, asking him for some validity or not, because we know what the internet is like. He mentioned to me that he said, you may recall from my preliminary statement that we made investigations starting in 2010 when we were actively involved in the development about and not reacting to those assertions at all. Rather, they were initiated by our contractor on site due to productivity issues. And he goes on to say that they made an investigation, however it was challenging, and they did provide better facilities. We supplied additional food to ensure that people were well fed, and we complained to the subcontractor, who he goes on to say, to some degree, remedied the situation. So he's claiming that he actually did have access and was able to investigate to some degree with them. But you're saying that they don't have any abilities at all.
Understanding, based on recent communications we had with Nevsun, is that they were not able to visit the site itself and not interview Sagan employees. And I mean, the other thing is that, as we talked about with the contribution to GDP, that Nevsun is in a very powerful position. It's not that they need to accept what government of Eritrea is asking them to do without any sort of ability to negotiate. So certainly, the least that they should be asking is to be able to monitor effectively the conditions in the camp of their subcontractor that they are paying.
I just wanted to give you another quote, again, Mr. Davis's comments. Back in 2008, when we really started this development project, we recognized that there was a potential national service issue with respect to the subcontractor. When we started employment with the subcontractor, engagement with the subcontractor, we hired an independent consultant that was recommended by the World Bank institutions, and they developed a process, quite a comprehensive process. Over the past number of years, naturally that process has even further developed. I mentioned some of that in my earlier statement. He's speaking about the fact that he's able to actually deal with that subcontractor now. However, his remarks were that he doesn't have as robust an influence with that subcontractor as he does with his own people. But you do see a difference with the people that are directly hired by Nevsun, who Mr. Davis said were there on their own accord, and he had developed a process of interviewing them, and the subcontractor.
I mean, we have not heard any allegations that individuals that were employed directly by Nevsun had this problem. It's primarily the subcontractor.
And were you aware of this person who is acting as a consultant from the World Bank to remedy the situation with the subcontractor for Nevsun?
I mean, I heard the statement that he gave before this committee, but beyond that, no.
So you don't have any evidence of anything on the ground.
The initial discussions that we had with Nevson, it was quite apparent to us that they were not aware of the risk before they began the mine site development.
What date was that, Mr. Horn?
That were
your initial conversations, yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but I believe it would have been early 2012.
Okay.
And Nevson, as mentioned, Nevson were very forthcoming with us, and it was a very sort of open dialogue, which was appreciated. But it was clear that there wasn't a really good understanding of what some of the risks from National Service Program were for their company.
So there's a very significant divergence here then, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point that out for the record that Mr. Davis said clearly that back in 2008 they began this investigation specifically regarding the subcontractor. That's what I have in a transcript before me. And Mr. Horn is saying clearly that as far as their meetings that Nevson wasn't aware of the situation in 2012. So that concerns me that there's that 4 years disparity in there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sweet. Mr. Marston, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Horn. Pleased to have you here. Anybody going to that part of the world with the kind of government, and it's hard to even use the word government in relation to a system like they have. When Mr. Davis was before us and he said that there was no use of slave labor as such, listening to your testimony, it sounds to me like that there was a certain amount of, they were very naive when they went in here. I'm very reluctant to point fingers at any Canadian company and say they would deliberately engage slave labor or support it in any form. I would like to think that they wouldn't, but on the other hand, it sounds like they were really naive. Another statement that we had there, CSR page indicates the company's embarked on a number of programs in the community, local, regional, central government to ensure the benefits of their projects actually are widespread and that the community is fully and properly engaged with the development operations. That's a very nice statement, and I hope it's true. But what's your reaction to that statement?
I mean, there's certainly not a lot of evidence that that statement has been sort of followed through on or implemented. It seems that Nevson took a lot of what they heard from the government of Eritrea at face value and didn't do their own investigations and didn't perform proper due diligence to see what some of the risks were. Well,
you have to question whether that's benign neglect and that it's to their advantage not to know. And I don't want to make accusations here because it's a very, very difficult place to function. From the standpoint of a committee of Parliament, if we're trying to look at where we can go to influence a situation like that, obviously Canadian companies would be one of the places that we could start. And in fact, because of suggestions in the Parliament about a Corporate Social Responsibility Act, and I think it was Bill 300, if I remember correctly, that people tried to get through here, at least it drew attention to the fact that our companies do have a social responsibility when they're in these other countries. It's very important to us that your organization provides us with this kind of counter perspective of what's happening. Mm-hmm. How, in your organization's dealings in that country, what are your opportunities to actually explore what's happening there? I mean, I can't imagine you having very much freedom.
It's very, very challenging. I mean, it is the most difficult environment in Africa to do human rights research of any sort. Like many organizations, we don't have access to the ground. So a lot of individuals that we interview are located outside of Eritrea, people that have fled national service. And there are many, 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 many refugees who have fled Eritrea's national service program, many of them here in Canada, many of them here in Ottawa. So we speak to them, and we use sort of creative means to try to corroborate some of the testimony and evidence that we hear. But at the end of the day, what happens in Eritrea is it's very difficult to find accurate information. No civil society, there's no independent media whatsoever. It's very, very difficult.
The witnesses that you talk about being in Canada, would there be anybody you think that would be worth having the opportunity for them to testify at our hearings?
I mean, certainly I'm sure there are individuals that might be willing to testify about national service. and some of the typical sort of violations that individuals face who are in the national service program. One of the things about Eritrea, though, is that Eritreans outside of Eritrea are also very afraid to speak. The Eritrean government typically targets their family members back home, and if you flee national service, there's a series of penalties that would be incurred by your family members. So it might be difficult to find somebody, but we can explore that.
Well, we might be better off going to information through organizations like yourselves in order to protect these individuals. But it was worth asking. How's my time, Mr. Chair?
2 more minutes of questions and answers.
2 minutes. Well, that's going to prove interesting. Are you aware of other companies in this country besides Canadian companies that are in like projects to Nevson and how they might compare to the Nevson's approach? Are we, on the scale of comparison, are we doing reasonably well at least? And if not, where would we have to ask them to move to really bring it up to where they should?
It's difficult to answer because Nevson is actually the first operational mine in Eritrea. The other two large companies are an Australian company, South Boulder, and then a Chinese company that recently bought out another Australian company. So they're just at the very beginning of their processes. So we hope that those two companies, along with the other Canadian company, Sunridge, begin to learn the lessons from Nevson. So it's difficult to say at this point because Nevson really was the first. Eritrea has had a very closed economy until it opened up recently for the mining.
Just by their productivity, you can see that they haven't evolved very well at all. Mr. Chair, just to let you know, I have an SO31, so I will have to leave very shortly.
Should I give you, or have the clerk give you a warning when we're getting close?
Well, that's okay. I think I'm just,
Okay.
I've got this, my BlackBerry.
All right.
Yes, we have to, encourage people on BlackBerry since they're a good Canadian company with good jobs and good pay, unlike ones that are made in China.
Okay. All right. By a happy coincidence, your time just ended. So we will move now to Ms. Greywall.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Horn, for your time and your presentation. Well, Human Rights Watch, they have described Eritrea as one of the most repressive countries, regimes in the world, and it has garnered very relatively little popular notice. So given the success of past rights awareness campaigns, what's stopping the situation in Eritrea from being high profile, and so what can be done to raise a little bit more awareness in the world?
Well, that's a very big question. Certainly there are a number of, while it's very difficult to get information from what's happening inside Eritrea, and Eritrea is under UN sanctions, like a lot of the things that we typically ask for have already been done. There is not a lot of private investment. There is not a lot of sort of aid money flowing into the country, so it closes off a lot of sort of traditional advocacy strategies. One thing we're seeing, though, with the opening up of the mining sector, that does provide, I think, some leverage for those corporations, but for the governments where those corporations are housed, to begin to push Eritrea on reforms. Eritrea needs those mines operational as much as the corporations need those mines. It is handing the regime a financial lifeline, which is critical. The other thing is that has been discussed at this committee in the past is the Eritrean consulate and embassies around the world collecting taxes from its diaspora members. And we haven't done any detailed research on that, so we can't speak to specifics, but certainly there are lots of allegations about consular services being denied if you don't pay the 2% income tax, along with other donations to national defense forces, etc. And there are numerous allegations about families back in Eritrea being targeted when individuals refuse to pay the diaspora tax. So I think that certainly provides an opportunity for governments that are hosting Eritrean diplomatic relationships to begin to have a bit of sway. And certainly in Canada, there is a consulate in Toronto.
Well, Eritrea's national service it's notable not only for its brutality but for its wide applicability, and Eritreans are called not only to serve in the military but to take construction and civil service jobs as well, and they're extremely low pay. How does the government maintain such a massive kind of program that adversely affects so many people in their country?
Yeah, the National Service Program is, I mean, it's quite incredible, the scale. As I mentioned, it was originally conceived as 18 months, but many people spend their entire lives in national service. And anyone that dares to flee or not participate is often jailed in very inhumane conditions. Torture is widespread. For a period of time, there was a sort of shoot-to-kill policy at the border for individuals that were fleeing Eritrea, often fleeing national service. Family members are targeted for those that flee national service. There is no opportunity for conscientious objection on religious grounds or any other grounds. So it really is a program where there's just no one has any choice. And even if you're lucky enough to get out of the program, to flee the country, your family members, your loved ones are targeted. So it's very, very difficult.
Authoritarian and totalitarian regimes go to great lengths to repress dissident in every form it can. So Eritrea has no free press and restricts assembly, but are there any kind of significant dissident groups which speak against the regime, or are there groups of Eritreans who work for reform?
There are many Eritrean diaspora groups located in Canada and elsewhere that openly speak out against the regime and try to push for political reform, for free and fair elections, for constitutional change, for everything. But their ability to bring about change is quite limited.
Well, Eritrea commonly uses the excuse of ongoing tensions and former conflict with Ethiopia to postpone its elections or expanding its international relations. So what are the prospects of improving Eritrea's relations with Ethiopia and the rest of the region?
I mean, I think that's a very complicated question. Certainly Eritrea are under UN sanctions because of their support for al-Shabaab in Somalia, and they've basically become the pariah of the international community and certainly of Africa. They do not have a lot of friends. Relationships with Ethiopia. I mean, again, it's difficult to know exactly what is happening. Complicated, nuanced. But certainly the government of Eritrea uses the threat of Ethiopia as a reason or as a justification for national service and for as you say, for not holding elections and for keeping sort of that constant state of fear that people are under.
Eritrea is very strict in its limits on religious practice and observance. So why does the Eritrean government see faiths as kind of threatening, and how have those organizations chosen to be legal, dealt with the burden of an invasive government? Could you say something about that?
Again, we haven't done any recent detailed research on that, but in a nutshell, I mean, there are, I believe it's 5 religions that are allowed in Eritrea, and all other religions are banned. And those that practice those religions are arrested and often tortured and told to sort of denounce their faith. I mean, there's been a number of stories about Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, who have been tortured, arrested and tortured solely because they refuse to renounce their faith. So yeah, that's a huge concern, obviously. And those individuals that belong to religions that don't want to participate in national service are not given the right to opt out.
Thank you. We have to move on. I know that Ms. Grewal had another question. I'm going to try, if we can go through all of them, to come back to her, because I can tell you were working up something that was important, but I have to respect the rotation. So, Professor Kotler, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witness for his testimony here. As you may recall, in his appearance before our committee, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Neves and Cliff Davis testified that the 1,194 Eritrean nationals employed at the Bisha site, 88% of the total that are employed there, are, quote, there of their own free will, and went on to say they received
pay far above Eritrean standards in addition to medical care, free food and accommodation at the mine. When I asked Mr. Davis if he was aware of human rights violations in Eritrea, generally speaking, he said no. When I asked him if he was ever advised about human rights violations in Eritrea by anyone, he said no. When I asked him if he was aware of human rights violations at the Bisha mine site, he said no. When I asked him if he was advised by anyone of human rights violations at the Bisha mine, he said no. When I asked him, and I'm just summarizing, whether he had ever conveyed to the Eritrean government any concern of any kind about any human rights violation, his answer to me was, I don't acknowledge the premise of my question, because that's a premise that is asserted by people outside of our mine site, and there are no human rights violations on our mine site. So in the end, it was, in my view, a presentation which I characterized, and I trust I wasn't being unfair, but that was, as a result of the testimony, a testimony that appeared to hear no evil, speak no evil, and see no evil. And it's interesting that after the release of your report, NESN issued a statement on January 11th indicating that it had taken steps to prevent the use of forced labor by subcontractors at the Bisha mine site, but expressing regret of certain employees of SEGAN were conscripts 4 years ago. So again, it seemed to me to disclaim accountability in that regard as well. So my question to you now is one, do you think that the appointment of a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea could have a positive impact on the situation of human rights in Eritrea? And is there anything that Canada can do to help support the special rapporteur? And a second question, I have others, but just for reasons of time, what specifically might Canadian parliamentarians be able to do, to raise the profile of concern about human rights issues in Eritrea, whether we could engage effectively at all with the government of Eritrea or other stakeholders in order to improve the human rights situation in Eritrea generally and with regard to the mining in particular?
I mean, certainly Eritrea's human rights record is not a surprise. I mean, if you Google Eritrea human rights, you'll get a whole list of different things. So for him to say that he was not aware of human rights concerns in Eritrea generally, I mean, I don't accept that unless he just doesn't want to know. In terms of on his mine site, is there human rights violations? He says no. I say he doesn't know. Like they've openly said that even though they put these procedures in place, they aren't allowed to visit the camp where these allegations were made. I mean, that's a pretty significant gap. So I would say that in terms of, I mean, I think that given that Canadian companies are now involved in Eritrea, Nevsun and Sunridge Gold, with the possibility of more, and given that the Eritrean government operates a consulate here where they collect a tax from the Eritrean Canadian citizens, which provides them a financial lifeline, I think the government of Canada does have some leverage to engage with Eritrea and to push for an improvement of the human rights situation there. I mean, a number of, Canada generously admits many Eritreans to Canada as refugees, and many of those Eritreans are fleeing the very program that a Canadian company is profiting off of. I mean, that causes me great concern.
Professor.
Okay. Do you think, or have you noticed any change as a result of your report with regard to the operation in the mining area and the operation of Nevsun in that regard?
As you mentioned, the processes have been put in place since our report to kind of try to limit the potential for the use of forced labor. But given the difficulty of accessing the site, it's very difficult to assess whether or not it's had an actual impact on the ground. We do hope that the other companies, Sunridge, South Boulder, etc., now that this this report is out there, they can't say they don't know. And so hopefully they can put in procedures in place prior to their mine sites being developed, so they can begin to address some of these issues and some of the other human rights risks that could occur on the mine site.
The other companies you just mentioned there, Sunridge?
Sunridge is the Canadian company, and South Boulder is an Australian company.
Right, okay.
Involved in potash.
Got it, okay. And are they, forgive me, this has already been mentioned, but I'm forgetting, are they both bidding for the same site to develop? Is that what's going on? Or are they developing two separate sites?
They developed two separate sites, and they're in, from what I understand, they're beginning production in the next 1 or 2 years, I can't recall, but they're on the verge of developing their mine sites.
Right.
There are also numerous other, from what we understand, numerous other mineral development opportunities that different firms in Canada and elsewhere are exploring.
Within the boundaries of Eritrea?
Within the boundaries of Eritrea, yes.
Right.
Eritrea is very rich in gold, copper, zinc, potash, etc.
Right, thank you. Okay. Mr. Schellenberger, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your insight here today. How would you characterize Eritrea's form of government? Like power within the Eritrean government is reported to be highly concentrated around the president. Do you believe these reports are accurate?
Our information or our conclusions on very little information, like everyone else. But from what we understand, yes, the power is very highly concentrated in the president.
To what extent does the government of Eritrea allow for free speech, particularly political dissent, and how are journalists treated?
There's no opportunity for free speech, no opportunity for dissent, absolutely nothing. Journalists are imprisoned, unlike anywhere else in Africa. There are many journalists in prison that there's been no formal charges, no trials, no one knows where they are, no one knows if they're alive or dead. No, the situation in Eritrea in terms of free speech is just, it's terrible.
You've mentioned the judiciary. To what extent is Eritrea's judiciary able to operate independently from the country's executive powers?
From what we understand, they have no ability to do that. No ability.
So, in retrospect, there's no court system.
I mean, a lot of the mechanisms that you would see in other countries and in democracies for dealing with some of these issues just don't exist in Eritrea. They may exist on paper, but in practice, they don't exist.
When we hear of all the human rights violations, it's hard to imagine slavery and all that goes along with that practice at this time in the 21st century. As you have said, there are 5 religions in Eritrea. Is there a dominant religion?
Depends who you ask, but generally speaking, the country is half Muslim, half Christian.
Okay. Is there any Islamic terrorism in Eritrea?
Not that we know of in Eritrea, but Eritrea does support, according to the UN monitoring group, does support al-Shabaab in Somalia.
Okay. Do they practice any Sharia law?
No.
None? I think that's all the questions I have.
All right, Mr. Schellenberger, thank you. We go then to Monsieur Jacob, s'il vous plaît. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witness. In your opinion, the principles regarding human rights, could they help mining companies that carry out their activities in Eritrea, ensuring that they do not contribute to the violation of human rights? And are there particular principles that, in your opinion, are more important in this particular Eritrea context?
There are numerous human rights issues in Eritrea and with the National Service Program, but our research focused mainly on the treatment of laborers, workers for SIGIN. So looking at the forced nature of the employees. So certainly that's what our recommendations have focused on, ensuring that forced labor does not happen, ensuring that the conditions for the workers are appropriate and in line with international best practice, and in line with what we would expect here in Canada.
Merci.
Thank you. If I've understood correctly, individuals, communities and Eritrean stakeholders cannot express themselves freely about their concerns about mining operations in Eritrea. Do you have any suggestions about how mining companies that carry out their operations in Eritrea to locally recruit and so that communities can communicate their concerns concerning human rights violations, work, society and the environment?
Certainly, if you're going to do business with a dictator, it's going to be very, very challenging. But what we would like to see is that, as I mentioned, Nevson and other Canadian companies have a lot of leverage. Eritrea is desperate financially right now. They have no capacity to develop these mining sites themselves. So as such, the Canadian companies or companies from wherever can ensure and demand that there are opportunities for individuals who are working for either Nevson or for the subcontractors to express their grievances, to be protected, and for those grievances to be dealt with in an appropriate manner. That's not to say that it will be easy to do such a thing in a repressive environment like Eritrea, but all we can ask is that they try to undertake that process.
Ok, donc merci.
Thank you. So you spoke about voluntary standards concerning social corporate responsibility. But is that enough? What can Canada do in addition to that?
Have the legal right to monitor the operations of a company like Nevson, when any company that's working in a repressive environment like Eritrea, at an absolute minimum. And we would also like to see that Canada has the ability to regulate those companies and the human rights performance of those companies, and begin to ensure that Canadian companies abroad are falling in line with what we would expect here in Canada.
Merci, Monsieur Horn.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If there's any time left, I will hand it over to my colleague. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for your appearance today. We've had a representative from Nevson coming to testify in front of the committee. I don't recall when. And I was reading in the news that the company has 50% parts that is Canadian, but the other 50% belongs to the government of Eritrea. So it's like a kind of a partnership with the government of Eritrea. So do you think that it's really ethical for a company that knows that this is the second most militarized country and one of the worst countries for respects of human rights to own with a government of that type, a company with 50% shares of the profits, where we all know that the profits are probably not going to the Eritrean people, but going to buy military assessments?
Yeah, no, it's a difficult question. I mean, we don't know a lot about how that sort of business arrangement was arrived at, and what sort of leverage Nevson had prior to going into business with the government of Eritrea. But yeah, certainly if you're in, as I mentioned earlier, if you're in sort of relationship with a repressive government, it limits your ability to bring about some positive change. Our understanding is that 60% of the company is owned by Nevson Resources. Yeah, no, it definitely makes for a challenging situation.
And there are some problems with the identification of workers that we know that the military services is something that is obligatory in Eritrea. So there's questioning. The company says it does verify, the certificates of the workers saying they do not work or they are not doing military services. So have any particular proofs of how does the company function and how does this military certificates are attributed? So there's probably some issues about that too.
Yeah, we don't have too many details, unfortunately, about this latest screening process that Nevson is undertaking. I mean, certainly, if you're not allowed access to the individuals who supposedly have these DEMO certificates to interview them openly, confidentially, etc., then I think there's lots of opportunities for misuse of those certificates and what they're supposed to represent.
Thank you very much.
Quickly. Mr. Horn, I had actually intended at this point to go back to Ms. Graywall, who was asking a question about religious liberty but ran out of time. I gather she had to leave to go to an SDIR 31 in the House. So perhaps I have a couple of questions, if I may. The first one actually is to follow up on what she was saying about the whole question of religious liberty. We had asked questions earlier when Alex Neve was here on the subject. I'd asked him about religious liberty. It was a very odd mixture of religions that were permitted but were not permitted, and I said, I've never seen anything like this. I'm used to seeing some place where we have one permitted religion and that's that. Seeing four, and it's an unusual mixture of four. I was particularly curious as to how the Lutherans got in there. I since had the chance to chat with someone who is an Eritrean living in Canada who suggested that this is all really about trying to keep Pentecostalism from spreading because it is something that is not a centrally controlled religious movement. I have no idea if that's actually correct. I only have that one piece of information passed on to me. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, we certainly haven't done any research into the into the religious intolerance issue. I mean, I imagine it also stems from sort of the religions that were in place when Eritrea became a country, and but beyond that, I'm not really sure. Okay, all right, thank you. That remains a little bit of a mystery, and perhaps is not totally germane to the question of mining. I wanted to ask a couple other questions, though, if you don't mind. The Eritrean government's involvement in the trafficking of persons, do you have any information on that you'd be able to share with us? Yeah, we're in the process of doing some research on that issue. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's an issue of huge concern. Many individuals leaving Eritrea, fleeing across the border, are being picked up in some of the refugee camps on the Sudan side of the border. Some are paying to be trafficked, and others are paying to be transferred well, largely to Israel. Others are being sort of kidnapped and trafficked and sent along the way through different hands until they get to the Sinai Peninsula. And in the Sinai Peninsula, there is a number of strong allegations of torture, of these Eritreans being tortured, and of family members in the West being pressured into providing payments to the smugglers in exchange for the Eritreans being released, at which point they go into Israel. So it's a form of a kidnapping for cash arrangement that is underway. Okay. Are Eritreans, I know there's an issue of illegal immigrants coming, which are just described normally in news reports as Africans coming into Israel, and there's been, I gather, some kind of recent agreement with the Egyptian government to try and firm up the border and prevent that from occurring. Are those primarily Eritreans who are actually coming into Israel across the Sinai then? I mean, as I mentioned, we're doing some research on it, and hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to answer those questions with much more accuracy and precision. But as far as we understand, yes, it is primarily Eritreans that are making it across into Israel. Okay. Turning back to the issue of mining, and particularly of the whole concept of corporate social responsibility, Nevson has indicated that they have a self-auditing process to make sure they meet up with certain internal standards as to behavior and treatment of their employees. They have a limited amount of information on their website, and I have to assume they must have a more complete internal document of which we do not have possession. So I guess the obvious question here I have is, first of all, if you have any further information on that, or if you have any thoughts as to how such standards ought to be, whether they should be made public, if so, how, both for Nevson and for other companies that might find themselves operating in Eritrea. And of course, I'm also thinking a little bit more broadly and thinking of Canadian-based or traded companies that
find themselves operating in other parts of the world. Eritrea may be a worse case, but it's not a unique situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't have any additional information on their CSR initiatives beyond what they've shared with us and with this committee. I mean, certainly some of the utterances of Nevson about the lack of ability they have to engage with government of Eritrea and to engage with their subcontractor would kind of set off some alarm bells for me in terms of those CSR numbers. You know, are they what is their methodology? Are they free to genuinely collect this information, or is it all just a case of trying to get some numbers on a piece of paper to show that they're doing something? And I think those would be very excellent questions to ask Nevson. You know, we would like the Canadian. I mean, voluntary disclosure and voluntary monitoring processes are the first step. We would like governments, including the Canadian government, to take it one step further and to actually do some monitoring themselves, or at least to ensure that the methodology that is being used is sound and that they are genuinely trying to minimize their adverse impacts.
I gather there's a set of standards that are, I gather, in process right now called the Guiding Principles on Human Rights that are being developed. Forgive me, this is actually our analyst who said to me, is right, it's at a UN body that... So these are UN Human Rights Council's principles that can assist mining companies operating in places like Eritrea to ensure they don't contribute in some way or another to human rights violations. Are you familiar with this, and do you think this sort of thing, an attempt to create a kind of standards internationally that can be applied and I assume externally audited, do you think that has merit? And if you have any further comments as to how that process could potentially be the maximum benefit that could be achieved from it?
I mean, certainly the human rights obligations of corporations in international law are a little bit murky, to say the least. So certainly guiding principles like that said are a step in the right direction, but I guess we do feel ultimately that it is up to states to ensure that corporate entities that are operating within their borders are complying with some of these sort of big picture overarching principles. So a step in the right direction, but we would hope that Canada could push Nevson to improve its record in Eritrea.
Yes, Madame Piclet has another question.
I really recommend that you should read the testimony of the representative of Nevson that we had in the committee. And actually, I remember that at the end of the committee, our estimate colleague asked a question, and the representative said that he has never heard of any human rights violation in Eritrea. And he has said that nobody has ever complained, and that he has never seen anything on the news where the government of Eritrea would be responsible, or, you know, such human rights violations are happening on the ground in Eritrea. So would you have something to say about a statement like this?
And that to be an absolutely incredible statement. I mean, certainly Eritrea doesn't exactly dominate the headlines because it's a small country and because there is no independent media, as we've talked about. But it is not hard to find out about the human rights situation in Eritrea. And if you're going to be making a major investment in a country, I think you would do a bit of background research. It's not hidden. As I said, we've done reports that outline some of these issues in the past. Amnesty International has done them. Many organizations have done them. There's a plethora of Eritrean diaspora websites that outline some of these concerns. It's not a secret. It's not hidden. You don't have to dig very deep if you want to know.
This will be my last question. Vis-a-vis the kinds of standards that or principles that potentially could be put in place, and as I say this, I'm cognizant of the fact that Canada is a disproportionate player internationally in the mining scene. My impression is that the power of a corporation that is thinking of going into a country like Eritrea, which is cash poor, the corporation is cash rich, is maximized in the period before the investments have been made. Once you've made your investment, once you've sunk many millions of dollars into the mining site, the power shifts in favor of the government, and therefore that it is harder to impose on a company that already has an existing mine versus one that does not yet have an existing mine. For example, I could see how independent auditing would be much easier to establish with someone who hasn't yet gone in as a condition for one thing, the potential beneficiaries of some form of forced labor, domestic beneficiaries in the regime, will see no profit if the mine doesn't go forward, or if it goes forward with a less competent firm from another country. But once the mine's in place, their incentives have changed as well. I throw that as a comment, but I'm also, of course, inviting your thoughts on that. I think that would dictate, if we have such standards, how they are designed to some degree, just recognizing the practicalities of the way the world works.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree completely, which, again, is, why companies need to develop these processes before they go in, because, as you say, they have they do have a lot of leverage. They are cash rich, but once the mine is operational, it's much, much more difficult. So, the position that Nevson is in now is a difficult one because a lot of that leverage is gone. But they still do have some leverage. So we are hoping that this report, this research, this discussion can kind of serve as a red flag for other companies that are doing business, to use that leverage that they have before they begin operating, so that we don't have to have these type of hearings and discussions about Canadian companies operating in repressive environments who have ignored human rights risks until it's too late.
Thank you very much for your testimony today, Mr. Herman. We're very appreciative you could be here. I wonder if you'd be willing to leave behind copies of the reports you brought in. We can't distribute them until they're in both languages, but we'll try and ensure that they're made available to committee members in the 2 official languages. Very much appreciated.
I can definitely do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colleagues, we are actually right at the end of our time, so we are adjourned. Thank you. Oh, hang on. Before we go, it's okay? Okay, we are adjourned. Okay.